Today we have Senator Jeanne Shaheen in studio. Senator, thanks for joining us. I'm so glad to have you back here in person.
I know, in person and no mask.
Right? Even though it is a little bit farther apart on the thing here, it's still a lot of fun. So as soon as the state budget passed, the very next day, you were out there front and center opposing the new restrictions on abortion that are in that were passed as part of the budget trailer bill, restrictions on, or a full ban on late-term abortion, mandatory ultrasounds for all abortion procedures, even the prescribing of abortion medication, and oversight provisions that could lead to the defunding of the state's family planning network. Why did you feel it was so important, even though you represent New Hampshire and Washington, to come back and jump into state politics and say this is wrong?
You know, I never thought I would see in New Hampshire, in our live free or die state, where the Republican Party has been so opposed to government intervening in people's private lives. Decisions by the legislature that say government is going to come in and come between women and their physicians. They're going to go into the bedrooms of married couples and tell them what they can do with respect to having children. It is just unconscionable. It's outrageous. We are going to have thousands of women in this state who are not going to get access to health care because of what this legislature has done. And it needs to change. And it's really disappointing to see Governor Sununu sign that legislation and refuse to take a stand on it.
Let's focus on the late-term abortion ban. Doctors here in New Hampshire say there are essentially no elective late-term abortions.
That's correct.
But I'm curious if you think there should be, if that should be an option. Should a woman have an option to terminate a pregnancy when essentially we know now, thanks to modern medicine, the baby would survive outside the womb?
Well, those abortions are done because of a concern about life or health of the mother, about other serious effects on the child, and so there is no need for this legislation. And certainly the idea that a woman is going to have an ultrasound, she's going to have to pay for it herself. The state is not going to cover those costs. It hinders, the objective is to prevent women from having the ability to determine their own reproductive futures and to determine how they want to address their family issues. And that is not right. Shouldn't happen anywhere. It certainly shouldn't happen in New Hampshire.
But should it be legal to terminate a pregnancy so late, just based on...
Well, it's not under the Roe v. Wade.
But in New Hampshire it was. A woman could seek a late-term abortion and presumably get it, I mean, without penalty.
But it didn't happen, Adam, because there were not providers here who did it, because women don't do it unless there's a serious injury to, potential injury to the child, the baby, or the mother. And so it's a red herring. That's not the issue. The issue is, are women going to have access to their own ability to make their decisions about their own bodies, about their own reproductive futures, or is the government going to make that decision? And what the legislature has said is, no, it doesn't matter what you think, what your doctor thinks, what your husband thinks, what your minister thinks, what the rest of your family thinks, we're going to decide that. And that is just wrong, and it shouldn't happen. And I can tell you what, if it were men in that situation, it wouldn't be happening, Adam.
What do you think the people will think, though? I mean, the electoral backlash, we're told, will materialize.
I think the people will be outraged about it when they realize it's happened. And if you look at polling, that says that women don't want government to make those decisions. Women want to make those decisions ourselves. And to suggest that women aren't serious in making decisions about what happens to the future of themselves and their families is insulting. It's insulting that the legislature thinks they should tell women what to do in those circumstances.
Politically, this is considered one of the third rails of New Hampshire politics, essentially, the other one being a broad-based tax. I'm curious, from a political perspective, you touched that other third rail, a broad-based tax, in the early 2000s and survived on your innate political skill. Isn't it possible Governor Sununu can do the exact same thing here, having supported something that most people would oppose?
Well, I don't know what Governor Sununu is going to do and what the impact is going to be. I'm just telling you, I think it's wrong, and I'm disappointed that this governor would pretend to be pro-choice and sign that kind of legislation.
Let's return to foreign policy. A lot to talk about on this front. You just returned from a trip to Eastern Europe. Essentially, the global approach there was dealing with Russia and its influence in the region. Energy policy and politics is huge over there, and we have the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which would deliver natural gas from Russia to Germany. The Germans want it, but we know that Russia uses these things to exact, they take their toll, essentially, using that energy. They can blackmail a huge part of the Western world. Should the United States try to stop this pipeline from being built?
Well, we already have. I sponsored legislation to put sanctions on those companies who were engaged in building Nord Stream 2. We did stop it for some period of time, and then Russia went around the sanctions and has continued to build it. The administration, the Biden administration, put sanctions in place and then waived those sanctions on the two major companies so that they could try and negotiate with the Germans to see if we could bring the Germans to the table to help address the challenges that are going to be created for Ukraine, primarily by Nord Stream 2, and also to try and ensure that that Germany is willing to work with us if Russia tries to use that pipeline for exactly the kind of coercive measures that you're talking about. So we have yet to see what the outcome of that will be. I continue to believe that we should keep the threat of sanctions open and that we need to do everything we can to help Ukraine. When we were on our visit to Eastern Europe, one of the countries we visited was Ukraine, and the Ukrainians were very concerned about what the impact on them was going to be, not just because of the loss in transit fees, because currently the pipeline goes through Ukraine, and so they get a significant amount of revenue through that, but also the ability of Russia to be able to use that pipeline against both Ukraine and against Europe, Western Europe.
Russia shows no sign of relenting in its sponsored cyber attacks against the U.S. and the Western world. The most recent one, I think 1,500 businesses negatively impacted one way or the other. When does America fight back? I don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but it seems like we just sort of tolerate this and it continues.
Well, I think we're overdue in fighting back. I think we need to make it very clear to Russia, and I assume that President Biden did in his meeting with Vladimir Putin that we were going to take action if it continued to happen.
Cuba, unrest going on there right now. Obviously, this is a fraught relationship because of U.S. intervention there in the past. Some people want to exercise restraint. The Biden administration is saying maybe they will take action to try and restore internet access to allow dissidents to communicate there. But should the U.S. go farther? Is it time to try and foster more freedom there in Cuba?
Well, one of the reasons I've been in favor of opening up Cuba is because I think that does help foster more freedom and give people the opportunity to see what's happening. It's what happened in Eastern Europe. It's what happened with the fall of the Soviet Union. When people saw what was happening in the rest of the world, they wanted those freedoms for themselves. And we know that the Cubans are in that position now. They're affected economically by the harsh conditions there. They're affected because COVID has run rampant in Cuba, and they're affected because they don't have access to freedom. If you listen to them, what they were shouting in the streets was liberty, freedom. And I think we need to do what we can to support them. I don't think that means military insurgency into Cuba, but I do think we need to make it clear that we support the aspirations of the Cuban people.
Earlier this year, you took a lot of heat for your vote on a minimum wage aspect within the COVID relief bill, and you said essentially if you're going to support a minimum wage increase, it has to come with relief for businesses, essentially the mom and pop operations that really couldn't handle such a massive change in their financial structure. How much would have to be spent, in your opinion, to essentially get to that yes for you on a minimum wage increase? Well,
I think there are a series of things that we could do, and I support raising the minimum wage. What I don't support is changing the structure of the hospitality industry, restaurants, in the middle of a pandemic when they've already been hit so hard, and force them to change the way they basically pay all of their employees. So I think it's something that we should continue to work on. We know there are good examples in Maine, for example, where they pay a minimum wage and they pay a tipped wage that is a significant portion of that that's much higher than what we have in New Hampshire. So I think it's something we've got to keep working on because we need to ensure that people who are working, get a fair wage. And in New Hampshire, many of our restaurants already pay more than $15 an hour because they need to in order to get employees.
Right, and you know, the law says one thing, the labor market in reality says completely, I mean, isn't this the time, though, to bring the law up to match what the labor market is doing right now when it is happening?
Well, it is, but we need to do it in a way that doesn't hit those businesses, those restaurants really is what we're talking about, that have already been very hard hit by this pandemic. And again, as we told Senator Sanders, I would have been happy to have voted for the $15 an hour minimum wage if he had taken the tipped wage provisions out and allowed us to keep working on that, but he was not willing to do that.
I want to sneak in one last question here. It has to be on the pandemic. Overlooked that a little bit, but the door-to-door vaccine idea that President Biden floated, is that a bad idea with medical privacy to try and take the vaccine to people door-to-door?
I think we need to think about every way we can to encourage people to get vaccinated. The only way we're going to put this coronavirus fully behind us is if the majority of people in America and around the world are vaccinated. And in order to do that, we've got to be as creative as possible in letting people know all the ways that they can get vaccinated and making sure they understand the benefits and are educated about it, and that we push back at the misinformation that's out there about this vaccine, because most of it just isn't true.
All right, Senator Jeanne Shaheen, thank you so much for joining us on Close Up. We're eager to have you back here in the studio.
Nice to be
again.
here.
All right.